September 5th, 1862. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia launches an invasion of the North. Their goal, though few in the ranks know it, is Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, on the Susquehanna, an important communications and manufacturing center for the Northern war effort. In Pennsylvania, Confederate leaders hope to play upon Northern disaffection with the war. They plan to make a direct appeal to the Northern people to end the fighting, bypassing the political leadership in Washington. Southern troops on Northern soil might also cause panic in the stock market. It would gain the attention of the rest of the world, might even result in recognition of the Confederacy. Never have the prospects or the stakes been so high. While unaware of the political ramifications, the average Southern soldier knows something just as important. His side is winning, and one more victory might win it all.
Imagine a river about 500 yards wide, 2 to 3 feet deep and very swift, as full of men as it can be, all apparently jolly. I imagine some of them contemplated the serious side of the situation. While I was deeply impressed in the movement, yet I could not for the life of me suppress a feeling of sadness as I beheld that vast concourse of humanity wading the river, apparently never once thinking that their feet, many of them, would never again press the soil on the south side of the Potomac. Private John Stevens, Hood's Texas Brigade.
We're home now! We're here!
Shoulder! Oh! Sir, we are ready. All right, gentlemen, perfectly still.
The Union Army in September of 1862 that falls back into the defenses of Washington is not the army that we're going to know later in the war as the Army of the Potomac. This is a collection of 3 armies that were all thrown together in Washington, D.C. in September of 1862, but they were not a cohesive fighting force. If you were with the Union Army as it was retreating from the defeat at Manassas, you would have encountered men who were shuffling along, demoralized. They were angry because they didn't feel in their hearts that they'd been whipped on the battlefield.
And it's just at this moment when Union morale seems to be at its lowest point that word begins to filter down the line of march as these men are dejectedly straggling back toward Washington, as a courier will come riding down the line, waving his cap and shouting the news that George McClellan has once again been restored to command.
Who the hell are you? What are you talking about? Pope's back to command. Lincoln put him there. Pope is out. Little Matt's in command of the Army of the Potomac.
Everybody said who was there that it just created tremendous uproar. Men were throwing their hats in the air and cheering and grabbing each other. And as one man said, it was like a savior had come.
On to Richmond, boys. On to Richmond.
In 1862, George McClellan is only 36 years old, younger than all of his immediate subordinates. His popularity with the men comes from the pride he's instilled in them, and in their belief that he will not waste their lives. For the last year, McClellan's plan has been to prepare the huge citizen army for war, to make them soldiers,
Forward, bifiles left.
then methodically maneuver the Confederate army back on their capital at Richmond and force it to capitulate. For a while, in the spring of that year, it seemed to be working. Then a Yankee bullet removed the Confederate commander, Joe Johnston, and put Robert E. Lee in his place.
At this point in the Civil War, Lee was in his mid-50s. He was the very picture of good health. He had really never been ill, seriously ill, a day in his life. He was, in the words of Winfield Scott, the most handsome man ever to put on the uniform of an American soldier. By the 1st of September, 1862, Lee had produced one of the greatest turnarounds in military history. Think back, if you will, 3 months earlier, on June 1, the battered, disorganized Confederate army had been driven right into the earthworks at Richmond, and McClellan's powerful army at the Potomac seemed on the verge of seizing the Confederate capital and ending the war. But 3 months later, Lee had defeated one army, defeated another army sent to the First Army's rescue, and now was poised on the banks of the Potomac River to launch an invasion of the North itself. There is nothing in American military history that compares with this 90-day turnaround.
With the defeat of Federal forces near Richmond and aggressive Confederate moves in both Maryland and Kentucky, the war is taking a grim turn. In the South, there's the need to get the war out of Virginia, to gain European recognition, and to defeat the Union Army before it has a chance to recover. In the North, pressure comes from a growing coalition of hard war advocates, abolitionists, and the host of former slaves who flock to the Union Army wherever it goes. President Lincoln wants a limited war, one which preserves the Union but keeps pre-war institutions intact. Gradually, as Union defeats mount, Lincoln begins to favor new ways of defeating the South, including emancipation. But to free the slaves now, when everything is going wrong, might seem like desperation. So he will wait for the one thing that has been eluding him, a Union victory in the East.
Come on, give it tight. There you are, boys.
It's September 9th, 1862, and the Army of the Potomac is on the move across the state of Maryland, to come to grips with Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia. And now, at this moment, this was the payoff for McClellan, because now he needed those men. He needed them to shake off the despondency and the cloud of gloom that had settled upon them, and pick up their musket, lift their head, and to march forward again to do McClellan's bidding, because the country needed the men.
And then by thunder came the mighty 6 Wisconsin. And tell me, laddies, what does the bully 6 say? Hit him again! Hit him again! Hit him again! Hit him again!
Lee's invasion leaves a large Federal garrison, some 13,000 men, stranded at Harper's Ferry, the small arsenal town made famous by the abolitionist John Brown. Lee had expected this force to be withdrawn when he moved north. But since they've remained, Lee wants to capture the garrison. He sends half his army back to the Potomac under Thomas Stonewall Jackson.
It is at Harper's Ferry that Jackson, the artillerist, emerges. He had been an artillerist in the Mexican War. He had taught artillery at Virginia Military Institute. And it is at Harper's Ferry that he arranges his guns so beautifully, so magnificently, that early on the morning of September 15th, when he opened fire, the Union garrison quickly surrendered. It was Jackson the gunner at his magnificent best.
Lee's desire to capture Harper's Ferry was set in motion a chain of events that results in the bloodiest day in American history. Lee dictates his complicated plan in a communique entitled Special Order 191. Through a breakdown in communication, an extra copy of the order is prepared and then lost. It's found wrapped around 2 cigars in a farmer's field by 2 soldiers of the 27th Indiana. McClellan now knows exactly where Lee's army is and moves to crush part of it before it can be brought together. In an all-day battle, McClellan pushes Lee's rear guard off South Mountain and sends them streaming back toward the Potomac. It's a small but decisive Union victory. Lee's retreat from South Mountain brings his army to the small town of Sharpsburg between the Potomac and Antietam Creek. A couple of bends in the Potomac help Lee to firmly secure his flanks while still leaving him room to maneuver. He is encouraged by the fall of Harper's Ferry, but surprised at McClellan's quick response to his invasion. He had hoped to give battle near Harrisburg or even Baltimore. Now he is resigned to fight at Sharpsburg. If anything goes wrong, one of the widest rivers in the country will be between his army and safety. In evaluating the situation, Lee correctly predicts that McClellan will not be ready to attack on the 15th or even the 16th. Toward evening, McClellan sends Joe Hooker's First Corps across the Antietam, north of Lee's left flank, in an effort to get around the Confederates. Lee immediately counters by strengthening that end of his line. Among the units he sends north are John Hood's Texans and a battalion of artillery under Stephen Lee. One of his battery commanders is a Richmond physician, Captain William Parker. His command is made up of neighbors, friends, patients, and the sons of patients. The battery deploys on a rise of ground along the main road running north out of Sharpsburg. On the other side of the road is a modest little whitewashed church built by a pacifist sect of German Baptists, the Dunkers. It seems an ironic place to prepare to do battle.
It was a beautiful night, and no man who lay upon that field and realized the deep tragedy to be enacted on the morrow could but be sad and thoughtful. We thought of dear ones far away, and were glad that they knew not of the trying hour that the setting stars were bringing rapidly on. Captain William Parker.
It's about 5:30 in the morning when you start to get a little bit of light, like we have right now. So the entire brigade was ordered to its feet, with the 6th Wisconsin in the lead, followed by the 2nd and the 19th and the Indiana and the 7th Wisconsin. Their commander was John Gibbon. And Gibbon ordered the brigade forward, and it's near this point that Gibbon's going to encounter Joe Hooker. And Hooker's going to give him his orders. The orders are simple because you don't know anything about where anybody is. The Rebs are that direction, go get them.
It's dawn, we're on the Miller farm. It had been raining the night before, just like it did last night. There was ground fog along the hollows, just like it is here today. We're on the front of the Confederate line. This is where Georgia Brigade was positioned. They knew there were Federals out here in the cornfield. Artillery fire had opened before dawn, and so artillery shells were flying overhead. The Confederates knew something was going to happen. It was going to happen soon, and suddenly there was strong movement coming through the corn, coming in their direction.
Every man in our thin ranks lay low with his gun, ready to do or die. Then a grand sight met our eyes. Regimental standards floating in the morning air, indicating the advancing enemy. Isaac Bradwell, 21st Georgia Infantry.
We had 6 regiments of Georgians along here, and Colonel Marcellus Douglas felt it was the right moment. He gave the command for the men to rise, and as they rose, he gave the order at that point to fire directly into their front.
Our companies were marching forward through the thick corn. As we appeared at the edge of the cornfield, a long line of men in butternut and gray rose up from the ground. Major Rufus Dawes, 6th Wisconsin Volunteers.
This was the signal for the Confederates to open.
Simultaneously, the hostile battle lines opened a tremendous fire upon each other. Men, I cannot say, fell. They were knocked out of ranks by the dozens. Major Rufus Dawes, 6th Wisconsin Volunteers.
As the Union line of battle emerges from Miller's cornfield, a Louisiana brigade deploys along the west side of Hagerstown Pike. 2 Wisconsin regiments wheel about, lining up on the east side of the pike. For a few terrifying moments, these units are literally eyeball to eyeball.
This became the scene of one of the most bitter small action fights of the entire Civil War. You can imagine the picture. The Confederates fell back across the pike. They had to call through and over the fence. Soon there was a battle between these 2 units face to face, only a few yards apart, a no man's land in the road. Men were falling with very little protection from the fence, woods line. This was one of the most brutal eyeball to eyeball fights that the war was to see.
With their attention totally focused on the enemy in front of them, the Louisiana troops failed to see the rest of Gibbon's brigade swing around behind them.
The 7th Wisconsin was moving through this area, which at the time was a woodlot, part of the West Woods, open ground with very little underbrush, and this rock ledge here, which is going to be an ideal defensive work for the 7th Wisconsin.
Right, they can come up here, drop right down behind this defense work. Up there, about 180 yards away from them along the Hagerstown Pike, are the backs of the enemy soldiers. We're fighting with the 6th and 2nd Wisconsin and the other Union troops there. And now you've got the drop point.
We were brought up in the rear of a rebel brigade and laid in the woods. We fired 20 rounds before we was discovered, piling them in heaps as they lay behind the fence. After they discovered our position, well, then they threw down their arms and broke through the woods, what was left of them. Then we had fun picking them off. We might have taken them all prisoners, but we wasn't in for that. Even a wounded man could not be seen creeping off without being plugged by a mini-ball. Private Hugh Perkins, 7th Wisconsin Infantry.
The action on the north end of the battlefield is a series of moves and counterattacks. But slowly, the Union forces are gaining ground and advancing toward their main objective, the Dunker Church. This forces the Confederate left-wing commander Stonewall Jackson to call on his only reserve, Hood's division, including the Texas Brigade.
It's morning. The sun is rising, lighting up the east face of the Dunker Church, just as it is now. Hood's men are in the woods behind the church. They're hungry. They're tired. They've been marching for days, very little to eat for 3 days. Finally, in the early morning, those food wagons come up. Hood's men finally have a chance to eat. They start to light their fires. They're going to get what water and food they can.
Eugene, you're going to eat yours raw or wait on this fire?
I'll wait on you, Big Jim.
And then suddenly that rumble of artillery grows and the orders come. It's time for them to go into the fight.
Damn wood is so wet. There. Here it comes. Fall in. Damn, no. Damn it, no.
Leave it, Big Jim.
Lieutenant, I ain't had nothing today.
There's no time now. Leave it.
Yeah.
These lank and lean and famished Texans were angry as a bunch of hornets. But within 5 minutes, they had formed up into their company and regimental commands, into the brigade formations, and they began to move out from behind the Dunker Church, and move out along the Smoketown Road, where they'd form up in their brigade formations. It must have been magnificent to see those those men as they formed along here, almost 800, perhaps a little over 800 men that morning, as they formed up and prepared to march in this direction right into battle.
Kill General Lott to hold his position. We're on our way. We're advancing now. Forward! March!
This is one of the classic charges of the American Civil War. These Texans, full-throated, are pushing across these fields. They're having to go through the broken ranks of Lawton's and Trimble's men. They're also having to push back the Federals that had come through.
The 1st Texas entered a patch of corn and pursued the Federals to near the far side. The regiment, of its own notion and of one accord, advanced, loading and firing at will, unmindful of the galling and deadly fire into its ranks. Colonel Philip Work, commanding 1st Texas Infantry.
There was an appalling confusion of shattering sound, an unending chaos of violence and heat and intense combat, with fields and thickets wrapped in shifting layers of blinding smoke, so that no man could know and understand any more of what was happening than the part he could see immediately in front of him. Attack and counterattack took place in every conceivable direction and in no recognizable time sequence. Northerners and Southerners wrestling back and forth in the cornfield in one tremendous free-for-all. Who's captain?
Falling back to the southwest limit of the corn, we rallied upon our battle flags. Its bearers were all shot down, and we returned without them. Colonel Philip Work.
In support of Hooker's 1st Corps is Joseph Mansfield's 12th. The 12th Corps is exactly what Hooker needs, and even more troops, the 2nd Corps, are coming up to join him. A well-coordinated attack now could completely break the Confederates on that part of the field, and Hooker is the man to lead it. But at this critical moment, a stray bullet hits his foot, and the loss of blood puts him out of action. At about the same time, Mansfield, the only officer who knows what Hooker has in mind, is mortally wounded. Just as the Union Army's grand plan is beginning to take effect, its powerful right wing, fully half the army, is left without a leader. The Confederates continue their tenuous hold on the Dunker Church. In the fields across the road from the church, Parker's battery is still in position, firing case shot at advancing Union soldiers, switching to canister when they get close.
We're walking along Dunker Church Ridge. This is the very place where Stephen D. Lee's artillery was sighted, protecting the flank of Lee's army. It was aimed across the fields over here to my left, where Hooker's men were expected to come from. A great site for controlling those fields, but it was not only a blessing, but it was also a curse.
Well, for the batteries that were strung across here, they have a panoramic view of the areas to the north where the Federals are going to be coming from, but they also are in a position where they're going to receive a lot of counter-battery fire. Counter-battery fire from the north as well as from the Federal artillery to the east.
That's right. This place was called an artillery hell because the shells were pouring in from across the river, those big guns that McClellan had over there. Take a special kind of a man, those Confederates manning these Confederate guns, to fire at the Federals charging across the fields, trying to ignore the artillery coming into them. This was truly a terrible place to be.
Lieutenant, if I'm killed here, you tell my wife I've never been happier in my entire life. Yes, sir!
The advance of the 12th Corps forces Parker's battery, Hood's Texans, and the rest of the Confederate left wing to fall back beyond the Hagerstown Pike, giving up their hold on the Dunker Church. Into this void comes the lead division of Edwin Sumner's 2nd Corps. Sumner is an old dragoon officer, and he treats his infantry as horse soldiers, slashing straight forward, hammering their way through the enemy.
I want them to advance their line of battle. Brigade front, each division in column of brigades, like this, and this, and this. One after the other, do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Very good. Carry on.
It's about 9 o'clock in the morning, and the battle action now is going to change. It had been from the north to the south through Miller's cornfield, which we can see right over here to our right. Union troops moving in this direction, but now the attack from the Federals is going to be coming from the east to the west, and it's going to be Sedgwick's division of the 2nd Army Corps, 5,500 strong, advancing one brigade right behind the other in 3 parallel lines. On the far left of the center brigade is going to be the 7th Michigan Infantry.
This field is littered with the dying and wounded and dead soldiers that have been in the earlier combats across this ground, the litter and debris of battle, and they are feeling very confident in themselves and in this attack. They see no organized body of Confederates in front of them. They've got a very strong formation. They've got artillery support behind them along the edge of the east and north woods. Everything essentially portends that this is going to be the final sweep for victory here.
The soldiers in the 2nd and 3rd line of Sedgwick's division are relaxing, basically. If the front line's firing, these men have been under fire before. They've heard shooting before.
Captain, what they move us up there where all the shooting's going on? We can't do nothing from down here.
Yeah, Captain. We ain't never fought in lines like this before.
Generals know what they're doing.
Then an ominous sound came. It was the rebel yell rising from the south beyond the Dunker Church, and then the volume of fire dramatically increased.
Much of the maneuvering and strategy of the American Civil War involves getting on the opponent's flank. The goal is to place a large formation of riflemen in line, firing at the end of the enemy's line of battle. Sometimes this maneuver is accomplished by design. Quite often, it occurs by accident. In the West Woods and near the Dunker Church, a Confederate division under Lafayette McLaws accidentally works the flanking concept to perfection.
The attack of McLaws will be launched at almost exactly the same moment as the Federals break into this West Woods, and they'll slam into each other at that point. It becomes a tactical coup for the Confederates.
The Federal line snaps here. The Confederates will sweep them across the road behind the Dunker Church and keep herding them north with the intent of totally destroying every Federal soldier in the area.
Can you imagine the exuberance of these Confederate soldiers, these boys from South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, as they come sweeping through these fields, and they can see out in front, they can see these Union soldiers running up the Hagerstown Turnpike to the north. They've got them on the run.
It's just a second Manassas all over again.
Most often, you'll see official documents saying that my regiment retreated grudgingly, giving ground only when forced to by superior numbers, that I brought my command off in good order and did not leave until the regiment on my left had retreated.
That's complete garbage. These soldiers got out of there as fast as they possibly could, and many of these men, good soldiers, were completely panic-stricken and running for their lives. The only option they had left to them was to run, and that's precisely what they did.
Our regiment was practically annihilated. My men fell around me like dead flies on a frosty morning. Lieutenant James Peacock, 59th New York.
To Peter Zacharias, Monroe, Michigan. Dear parents, brothers, and sisters, I am wounded, mortally, I think. The fight rages around me. I have done my duty. This is my consolation. I left not the line until nearly all had fallen and colors gone. I'm getting weak. My arms are free, but my chest all is numb. The enemy trotting over me, the numbness up to my heart. Goodbye to all. Alan Zacharias, Captain, Company E, 7th Michigan Volunteers.
The fighting began at 5:30 in the morning. By 9 a.m., the Confederates had withstood the assaults of 3 separate Union corps and beaten all of them back. More than 12,000 men have been killed or wounded, 1 American every single second. And some of the worst fighting is yet to come. The bloodiest single-day battle in American history is fought in a series of actions, each disconnected from the one that came before or after. Immediately south of the Little White Church is an old sunken farm lane. It's a ready-made fortification, and the Confederates fully expect to use it. New federal formations will surely slide to the south, looking for an opening, and they'll run into Daniel Hill's Confederates in the road.
Almost 4 hours that Wednesday morning, the North Carolinians and Alabamians posted here in the sunken road waited and wondered, and doubtless hundreds of them were worried. The sound of battle up in the east and west woods and in the cornfield and the area around the Dunker Church was clearly audible, for it was less than a mile away. And as the hours of battle roared off to their left, they could hear the sound of combat coming closer and closer and closer. They knew full well that by mid-morning they too were likely to be under fire themselves.
Approaching the Confederates in the sunken road are the rest of Sumner's Second Corps, 2 divisions under Generals French and Richardson. These troops have lost track of their lead division under Sedgwick, the one that McLaws beat in the West Woods. Their instructions are to form on Sedgwick's flank, but Sedgwick is nowhere to be seen. Mistaking some units of the 12th Corps as their own lead division, French and Richardson go into line of battle, wheel to the south, and advance into a whirlwind.
And as this long line of men, shoulder to shoulder, is coming forward, it's like the curtain is rising on this landscape. You don't know where the enemy is. You're waiting. You know you're getting close to the enemy. You're keyed up.
Many Confederates who survived the second stage of that battle said that the waiting was worse than the actual fighting.
Ready?
My rifles flamed and roared in the Federals' faces like a blinding blaze of lightning, accompanied by the quick and deadly thunderbolt. The effect was appalling. The entire front line, with few exceptions, went down in the consuming blast. Colonel John B. Gordon, commanding 6th Alabama Volunteers.
As the first Union line of battle melts away, the second tops the ridge and comes under fire.
Kimball's brigade comes up, so you have eventually all of French's division, and the battle settles into this slugfest. Both sides just blazing away at each other.
Exposed on the crest, the Federals take enormous casualties and eventually fall back to the safety of the backside of the hill. There they meet the next regiment coming forward, the 8th Ohio. Unlike the green troops in the front ranks, these men are veterans. When they reach the top of the hill, they remain just below the crest, needing under cover to load and exposing themselves only when ready to fire.
The din is frightful. Our men are falling fast. We'd seen a great deal of service before now, but our fighting
had always been mostly of the desultory, skirmishing sort. What we see now looks to us more like systematic killing. Sergeant Thomas Galway, 8th Ohio Volunteers.
By about 11:30 or so, French's attack here against the sunken road has stalled completely. And at that point, the last of Sumner's divisions is going to arrive on the field to reinforce French.
Right, that's Richardson's division. And his leading unit is known as the Irish Brigade and is commanded by Brigadier General Thomas Marr. A brave man commanding brave soldiers. But Marr is going to lead his men, just like French did, straight forward against the enemy. No attempt at maneuver.
This is just a frontal attack that really is sort of senseless, and what he's going to do is sacrifice many of the best men in that brigade.
Aim!
With both of Sumner's divisions now engaged, the fighting becomes general all along the sunken road. Gradually, the weight of Union numbers begins to tell, and Confederate casualties mount.
Can you imagine what it must have been like on that morning when the Confederates were down in this particular section of the Bloody Lane?
You know, the Alabamians were settling down to the grim business of dealing out death as fast as they could to the Federals across the way. There were a line of Alabamians laying in the grass right across the edge of this fence, firing up at the Federals as fast as they could. Men behind them were loading muskets and handing them up to the better shots who were up in the front. Those barrels were heating up. Men were screaming as they got hit by the bullets on either side. Colonel Gordon was passing back and forth, trying to keep up the spirit of these men. The smell of death was in the air. This is why this place was called the Bloody Lane.
Once the Federals are able to extend beyond the end of the Confederate right flank and cross the lane and be able to fire down the length of it, that's when this lane becomes a death trap.
The entire Confederate front is beginning to collapse. It was like this fragile dam that had been holding back the Union tide suddenly cracked, broke, and as that part gave way, the entire line collapsed.
The Confederates began to withdraw from the sunken road, and much like the shadow of the clouds which were cast on the ground and rolling in our direction, the Confederates were coming toward us, moving across this area.
It was as though a cloud had settled over the Army of Northern Virginia, because if the center gave way, the Army would have to fall back.
As the Confederates began to move in this direction, they would stop momentarily, load their musket and fire. That was a major concern to them. They didn't want to be shot in the back.
At the Piper Farm, halfway between the sunken road and the town of Sharpsburg, Daniel Hill rallies his shattered division. With a scratch force of some 200 men, he personally leads a forlorn hope back toward the sunken road. Federal forces there beat it back with ease. Meanwhile, General Longstreet sets an example which those who witness it will never forget. Riding forward, his foot in a carpet slipper because of an earlier injury, Longstreet orders his own staff to man an abandoned artillery piece. Holding their horses, Longstreet helps direct their fire. The actions of Longstreet and Hill are pure bravado, but they halt the Federal advance and save the center of the Confederate line. The attention of both armies now moves south again to a little stone bridge across the Antietam.
The most tardy and most uncoordinated of all the Union attacks that bloody Wednesday came here at a span since called Burnside's Bridge. Antietam Creek now doesn't look like a formidable stream, but back then it was, wide and deep and swift-flowing. Burnside was a native of Indiana. He had gone through West Point in kind of lackadaisical fashion. What he lacked in ability, he more than made up for in congeniality. Everybody loved good old Burn. The fact of the matter is quite simply that Burnside squandered the organization of his troops here, and instead of sending them across Antietam in mass, he sent them across in little spurts, which made them fine targets for the Georgians up there on the hill.
Burnside's 9th Corps makes 4 separate attacks to take the lower bridge. The initial assault force gets lost and ends up well north of the bridge. Next, the 11th Connecticut is sent in. South of the bridge, Captain John Griswold leads a hopeless assault across the river straight into the rifles of the 2nd Georgia, posted on the hillside. Griswold and other members of his unit are left floating in the water.
I guess you won't be trying that again!
The 3rd assault uses the farm road leading to the bridge. Unfortunately for the Federals, the road runs along the edge of the creek for over 200 yards, exposing the men to the Confederates on the other side.
What the hell are you doing there? Straight out that line! Forward, for God's sake! Double quick time!
As the Federal column came down this old farm road, they're in tight columns of 4, they're at the double quick. And for the Confederates over on this side, it's like hitting targets in a shooting gallery.
Come on!
The Federal column disintegrates before it is halfway to the bridge.
Come on, you damn you! Coming back!
Pressure to take the bridge mounts. 2 regiments with the same numerical designation are picked to make a head-on assault straight across the field leading to the entrance to the bridge.
This is the 251st, the 51st New York and the 51st Pennsylvania, which are going to try to take the bridge where everyone else has failed. The 51st Pennsylvania is going to move over to the stone wall here, the 51st New York up to the rail fence here. These men here are going to have the best cover of all because the stone wall is going to stop a bullet a heck of a lot better than the rail fence over here.
Absolutely, and it's going to give them a chance to be able to load their muskets in a sheltered position so that they're only exposed for a few seconds of firing. And it's going to make a difference.
We've got all this fire converging upon the Confederate defenders up along the bluffs above us. And it's going to start to take its toll. These men here are going to sense the slackening of the fire over there. And now comes the time for them to get up from their cover and start to get over the bridge.
Sir! My company can go off the bridge and provide cover fire so the rest of the time can go off. That way we can all go. Very good. Come on, boys. Let's go over the bridge. Let's go. Come on. Have this little quick.
This really is a turning point in the fighting here at Burnside Bridge. The enlisted men themselves sense that there's a weakening, that there's an opportunity, and without orders or leader, they're just going to get up and dash on their own through the gate and onto the bridge itself.
Come on, Chaz, come on.
By 1 o'clock, this Federal movement, which began at 10 o'clock in the morning, finally was completed. It took 3 hours for the 9th Corps, General Burnside's, to cross this small creek, to come across this little bridge, and to finally take a position that was held by perhaps 400, 500 men. Those Georgians put up a heroic fight here against overwhelming odds.
Near mid-afternoon, Burnside finally broke through the Confederate line, took the heights, and was driving Toombs's men back. Lee's army stood in rightful position to be destroyed because Burnside's thrust would cut off his retreat to the south. And then in one of those great moments that live always in warfare, up came A.P. Hill. Pal Hill was then 36, a product of Virginia aristocracy, West Point graduate, a hard-driving, aggressive fighter. Jackson had left him at Harper's Ferry to mop up the situation there, and then Lee had summoned him early on the morning of the 17th. Hill drove his men hard the 17 miles up here, so hard, in fact, that he left fully half his division panning along the roadside in exhaustion.
We're on the southern end of the battlefield late in the afternoon on the 17th, on the extreme right of the Confederate line.
This was a critical and dramatic moment. The Federals were streaming toward Sharpsburg. The southern end of Lee's line is in peril. And then suddenly, troops show up on the roadway on the ridge ahead. It was the kind of event that seems like it had been staged only by Hollywood, because the Confederates that suddenly appeared to save the Army of Northern Virginia belonged to A.P. Hill's Light Division. These were the shock troops of Lee's army. They had marched some 17 miles from Harper's Ferry. It had taken them about 8 hours, and they were ready for a fight. And these were the creme de la creme of Lee's army. It was a coincidence, but a critical coincidence, because the very men, the best fighting troops that Lee needed to save him were going to show up at exactly the right place at exactly the right time.
When the long day finally ended and darkness settled over, the guns quieted down, and then began the worst sounds of all, the screams and moans and cries of thousands upon thousands of wounded men.
Take this man to the street path. Are you hit anywhere else? Go upstairs. Street path.
The casualties of that day beg a description. 5,000 men are dead. Another 18,500 are wounded, and it's reasonable to assume that 20% of them are going to die ultimately of their wounds. In short, casualties exceed 23,000 men, which are more dead and wounded in this one day at this one spot than occurred in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War combined. And this battle just stops you in its shock and its horror and its human cost.
Bring up the next one.
It's September 18th, the day after the battle. It's a dark, leaden day. There's a drizzle in the air. The terrible aftermath of the war's bloodiest day it could be seen all about.
Nowhere was the carnage on this battlefield more evident than around the little Dunker Church. The Dunker Church at this time was located in a no-man's land between the two armies.
When it became evident that there wasn't going to be any more fighting, at least not for this day, the armies declared a truce. And the men from both armies went into that area to bury the dead and to bring back their wounded.
I'd like to arrange a mutual exchange of the wounded, if that would be acceptable for you.
Agreed.
The men marveled at how friendly the truce had become. The day before, soldiers on each side had been trying to kill each other. They had been shooting wounded men, they had been shooting men who were trying to surrender. This day, they were brothers once again. They were exchanging thoughts about what had happened with each other. They were talking, they were exchanging tobacco and other items.
It seemed very curious to see the men of both sides come together and talk to each other when, day before, we were firing at each other. Kelvin Leach, Private, 4th North Carolina.
Among the witnesses to the truce on the 18th is the artist Alfred Ward. The next day, two new artists arrive. Alexander Gardner and his assistant James Gibson are employed by Matthew Brady, who operates photographic galleries in Washington and New York. With the two armies operating in Union territory, there seems a fine chance to capture some new images of war. What they find and photograph changes the way the public will think of warfare forever. Throughout the campaign and the battle, Robert E. Lee has been outnumbered by at least 2 to 1, and on September 18th, the disparity is unchanged. But since Lee remains ready to resume battle, McClellan suspects he has good reason to do so. McClellan waits until all of his forces arrive in the area, adjusts his shattered divisions, and prepares to resume the attack on the 19th. But during the night, Lee recrosses the Potomac, and the campaign, which held so much promise for the Confederacy, is over. The battle is a draw, but with the rebel army back in Virginia, it looks like victory enough for Abraham Lincoln. He allows the Confederacy 3 months to give it up. Otherwise, he will declare emancipation in all those areas still in armed rebellion. It's a step toward full emancipation. Freed black Americans and runaway slaves will take it the rest of the way. Ten months later, men of the 23rd Virginia find themselves on familiar ground. Lee's army is on the move again, and the route of the 23rd takes them back to the old battlefield near the Antietam, barely a mile from where they fought the year before.
Dear father, mother, and family, I have been this morning over the old Sharpsburg battlefield and have witnessed the most horrible sights that my eyes ever beheld. I saw the dead in any number just lying on top of the ground, their bones bleaching, and they by the many hundreds. Oh, what a horrible sight for human beings to look upon. God grant that the time may speedily come that peace may return to our once happy country and our lives be spared to meet each other again on earth. George Harlow, Private Company D, 23rd Virginia.
As the 23rd Virginia reaches the intersection in front of the Dunker Church, they turn right to the north toward Harrisburg and the road to Pennsylvania. Once more, the Army's goal is Harrisburg. But again, Lee will fail to reach the Susquehanna. Instead, 2 weeks later, he'll fight the Army of the Potomac at another small farming community, a town called Gettysburg.